This is the true, never-before-told history of the Hells Angels. Before I begin, let me first say that this club has more history than pretty much any club out there. I could probably make individual videos about every one of the stories that have played out throughout this club's existence. In this video, I will simply try to give an overview of the club's history point by point over the past 70+ years. The history of this club and its origin is shrouded in mystery. In order to tell their story, we must first tell the story of outlaw motorcycle club culture in Southern California. After its inception in the mid-1920s, the American Motorcyclist Association quickly spread throughout the country. Through the 1930s, Hollister, California hosted annual 4th of July Gypsy tours. They also began holding and sanctioning a number of other events in the state, as well as sanctioning clubs and race teams. The AMA to this day is not shy about, nor are they in denial of the fact that they have always been highly concerned about the public image of motorcycling in the United States. On their website, they make this very clear, as well as their stance on groups they call outlaw motorcyclists. The Put Your Best Will Forward campaign is a perfect example of the AMA's objective of presenting a certain image to the American public. A quote from one-time AMA director Lynn Kuckler regarding the campaign reads, "What we are planning is a program to encourage all motorcyclists to present a good appearance to the public. Not only by their personal appearance but also by their riding habits." By riding habits, he was referring to AMA riders installing quiet mufflers on their motorcycles to reduce noise pollution. During the time period that the AMA was holding its earlier events and mounting its straight-edge public relations campaign in California, there were a number of motorcycle clubs that had formed through the 1930s and 1940s that were comprised of young World War I and World War II veterans and graduates of the Harley-Davidson maintenance programs in the military. Groups like the Moonshiners, the Galloping Goose, the Booze Fighters, the Pissed Off Bastards, as well as others, were among the first groups to be labeled outlaws in the state and subsequently barred from participating in AMA races and events. In the 1930s, several of those clubs came together to form the Southern California Outlaw Federation of Clubs. The animosity between the AMA and many of the clubs in California that they deemed outlaws continued to brew under the surface, with dust-ups between AMA clubs and outlaw clubs becoming more and more common. And it was no coincidence that accounts from that time period indicate that the law always seemed to be on the side of the AMA. A member of a club called the Satan Slaves was quoted several years later in the early 1960s saying, "I can't ride and wear my colors out there by myself, or there will be 3 carloads of those guys showing up and running right over top of me." So the animosity between the AMA and the so-called outlaw clubs of Southern California was something that had been brewing under the surface for a long time, and it was during the Gypsy Tour of 1947 in Hollister that the tension between them would finally reach a boiling point. That 4th of July weekend, it was reported that members of the Pissed Off Bastards, Booze Fighters, Galloping Goose, and many other outlaw clubs converged on the town of Hollister despite being barred from participation in AMA events. It was during that weekend that the image of the Southern California outlaw biker was to be immortalized by news reports and a series of sensationalized photos. About 9 months later, in Fontana, California, is when the legend of the Hells Angels begins. As I said, their history is shrouded in mystery, and there are a few different versions told. In this video, I will relay those versions to you, the audience, and you can make your own choice on which to believe. One version claims that a member of the Pissed Off Bastards named Otto Friedli decided to leave the Bastards and start his own club in March of 1948. However, Friedli was later quoted saying, "Though I'm flattered people claim I founded the Hells Angels, it's not true. I was invited to my first Hells Angel meeting by a guy that was dating my ex-girlfriend. He said that they were already established as a club by the time he got there, and that the San Bernardino Hells Angels were just a group of guys that loved to have fun." Another version credits the Bishop family of San Bernardino, a large family with alleged ties to the Hells Angels fighter squadron from the war, with organizing members from a number of local clubs and creating the original Hells Angels of Purdue. The final version is told by a man named Dick White, who claimed that he started the club in the early 1950s. What we do know is this: The Hells Angels got started in San Bernardino, California, and by the mid-1950s there were already home movies being recorded of at least 20 young men in Southern California all wearing the original Hells Angels patch and riding Harley-Davidson motorcycles. I've seen the home movies myself, and the young men wearing the patches and riding their motorcycles looked to be in their late teens to early 20s. Then, in 1954, members of the Market Street Commandos broke away to form the second charter of the Hells Angels in San Francisco. From the group's inception, the very name Hells Angels conjured up so much interest and mystique among young people that the group quickly grew in popularity across the state of California. Shortly after the founding of the Frisco Charter, as the San Francisco Charter became known, the club opened charters in Sacramento and Gardena. Then on April 1 of 1957, Ralph "Sonny" Barger and a few of his friends had gotten a hold of a Hells Angel patch, and without any knowledge or permission from the club, they started their own charter of the Hells Angels in Oakland, California. On that day, a 1%er legend was born. That first patch that had been found by Sonny's friend Don Boots Reeves was said to be from Sacramento. Sonny and Boots took the patch to a local trophy shop and had the first original Oakland patches made. They were larger than the other patches and became known as the Barger Larger. The charters argued in those early years about which patch should be used, and ultimately the larger, more detailed patch became the official patch we see today. The lack of sanctioning for the Oakland Charter by the other existing charters was of little consequence, as from the moment they all met Sonny they knew they were in the presence of the man destined to lead their club into immortal legend. Sonny, like other legendary 1%er leaders over the years, grasped and understood something that very few people are able to understand. True 1%ers have an understanding of freedom and brotherhood that is nearly impossible to describe with words. For those that truly understand it, it's the only way to live. Sonny not only understood it, but he had the charisma, the intelligence, the discipline, and the strength to put it into practice within the club. Before Sonny came along, a number of the charters in California had little to no communication with each other, and it is said that some didn't even know that the others existed. Sonny knew that he was in possession of a knowledge that would change the world, and that with those two simple constants of freedom and brotherhood he would lead his club to their destiny of becoming the most notorious motorcycle club to ever grace the highways of America. The name alone. The Hells Angels. It rolls off one's tongue as though the name has existed forever. There is an infinite power in the undying support of brothers that truly love and care about one another. All of this being harnessed by Sonny and his charismatic leadership, it wasn't long before the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club became a household name across the country. Newspapers told tales of this marauding caravan of partying youngsters and their exploits, just as they had written about the bandits of the Wild West like Billy the Kid and Butch Cassidy a century earlier. There has always been much debate regarding the origin of the statement that 99% of motorcycle riders are good law-abiding citizens. It's the other 1% that cause all the trouble. Some say it was the AMA, though the AMA denies ever making the statement. Some say it was written in the San Francisco Chronicle, though I myself have never seen the article. Others say it was a statement made over the radio, and that's the reason it can't be found written anywhere. Then there's the Tecate version of the story that claims that after the Angels and other clubs got into a drunken brawl and burned a bunch of furniture in a bonfire in Tecate, Mexico, that a Mexican sheriff made a statement about 1%, though it is likely the sheriff was simply repeating something he had already heard, because the Tecate incident occurred in 1961 and the meeting held by Frank Sadalek and the Frisco Angels took place in 1957. Whatever the case, one thing that is documented is that Frank Sadalek, the president of the Frisco Angels, created the first illustration of a 1%er diamond in the year 1957 when he called a meeting of all of the outlaw clubs of the Bay Area in California, and together they created a list of clubs that would sport the 1% diamond Frank had created and the color scheme each of the clubs would use. The 1%er patch was to be a patch representing the beliefs of the club wearing it. A belief in the philosophy of the American Outlaw Motorcycle Club, which was a philosophy created in rebellion of the tyrannical policies and tactics of the American Motorcyclist Association and law enforcement. The Outlaws came up with their middle finger to the AMA patch, and the Angels came up with their 1%er patch. It's all geared toward a love and respect of freedom and an unwritten agreement to defend and never trample on that freedom. After the meeting was held in the Bay Area regarding the 1%er diamond and the clubs in California being sanctioned to wear it by the Angels, it became a known rite of passage and respect for the most notorious of clubs in the country to become recognized by the Hells Angels if they chose to wear a 1%er diamond as a club themselves. In the early 1960s, a club was founded in the Midwest by a young chopper builder named Tom Fugel and his friend Tiny, who happened to be a Hells Angel from California. The club was called El Forastero. Upon creating their new club, they decided early on that the 1% moniker represented everything they stood for and believed in. Tiny, having been a Hells Angel himself, felt that there was only one avenue to take if they wanted to wear that 1%, so they traveled to California, explained to the Angels what they planned to do, and became the first out-of-state club to be recognized by the Angels as a 1%er club. They put the 1%er diamond right in the middle of their club's back patch, where it has proudly sat ever since. Shortly after El Forastero made the pilgrimage to California to be recognized by the Angels, a club from Chicago called the Outlaws followed suit and became the first club east of the Mississippi to be recognized as 1%ers. Back to the Angels. The 1960s were a momentous time for the Angels. They opened their first international charter in Auckland, New Zealand in 1961. And their first charter in a state of the U.S. outside of California in Omaha, Nebraska in 1966, followed by their first East Coast charter in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1967. The 1960s was also the decade that law enforcement first mounted a campaign and ultimately an all-out war on the Angels that has lasted to this very day. The trouble with law enforcement was a perfect storm of converging factors that resulted in the California Angels becoming public enemy number one in the eyes of law enforcement. The first factor at play was the connection between the AMA, politicians, and law enforcement. When groups of skilled riders were barred from participation in AMA events, they rebelled by setting up their own motorcycle events, which became a source of competition for the AMA, as young people often preferred the more relaxed and free atmosphere of the non-sanctioned events. So the AMA fought back by declaring the events outlawed events, and the clubs that hosted them outlaw clubs, as well as sending their friends and local law enforcement to shut down the unsanctioned races in the grounds that they had no permits, no insurance, and no emergency medical technicians on site. These early run-ins with the law were nothing major, but what they did do was set the stage for the bitter rivalry between law enforcement and outlaw motorcycle clubs over the next half a century and more. In 1957, at an AMA Gypsy tour in Angels Camp, California, the Hells Angels made an appearance at the event, and when two Angels were attempting to pull off a stunt, they plowed into a crowd of onlookers at high speed, instantly killing both of themselves in the crash and injuring several other people. It was a publicized tragedy that demonized the Angels, though no one got in any kind of trouble with the law. The first publicized run-in that the Angels had with law enforcement in California was the so-called takeover of Porterville in 1963, when over 100 Hells Angels rolled into the small California town and overwhelmed their modest police department. This was followed by what became known as the Monterey rape case, where some Angels were accused of raping two underage girls while the club was on a run and passing through the town of Monterey. The charges were eventually dropped, but the message being delivered to the public was clear. The Hells Angels were being portrayed as a lawless group of criminals that was roaming town to town, committing horrific crime and aggressively attacking the values that Americans hold most dear. This image that was being sold to the general public was no accident. The powers that be saw the Angels as a threat to be eliminated because they feared the freedom that the Angels represented. That's my opinion anyway. From the day of the so-called Monterey rape case forward, all the way until today, has been a constant campaign against the Angels by law enforcement. In a television special done in 1965 about the Angels, a member of a club called the Satan Slaves, which was a brother club of the Angels and eventually became part of the Angels, was quoted saying, "We don't claim to be a bunch of do-gooders because we're not. That's why we're not AMA riders. We're just what we are. We just want to be left alone, and if they'll leave us alone, everything will be just real fine." And another member was quoted saying, "They've got us portrayed like we're some big crime group, and I just want to let them know that I'm just out to ride my bike and have a good time with my brothers." Nevertheless, after the highly publicized trial of the incident in Monterey, the Attorney General of the state of California Thomas Lynch created a report that became known as the Lynch Report. In the report he claims that the Hells Angels are a menace to society. He equates them to street gangs and other organized crime groups and demands that action be taken against them by law enforcement. It is my personal opinion that proof of Lynch's less than honorable intentions can be found in the interview he did on the report, where he admitted that he'd never met or had a conversation with any angels, and he also decided to make an attempt at publicly humiliating the club and its members by saying that the first thing they were all in desperate need of was a bath. Just one of any number of dishonorable tactics that the powers that be have used against clubs like the Angels. But no matter what the law threw at the Angels, it only made them stronger every time. In the 1960s it was said that Sonny arranged deals with the Oakland Sheriff's Department to exchange large caches of weapons in exchange for the release of Hells Angels from jail. An arrangement reminiscent of the 2008 show Sons of Anarchy, where Sonny and several other Angels acted as technical advisors as well as playing acting roles on the show. In early 1965, a journalist named Joe Bride and a photographer named Bill Ray from Life magazine went and spent several weeks with the California Hells Angels and produced a historic piece about the club that brought them a whole new level of national fame. The Life photographer Bill Ray was quoted saying this was a new breed of rebel. They didn't have jobs. They absolutely despised everything that most Americans value and strive for: stability, security. They rode their bikes, hung out in bars for days at a time, fought with anyone who messed with them. They were self-contained, with their own set of rules, their own code of behavior. It was extraordinary to be around. The epic photographs taken and the words written by the bewildered journalist brought the California Motorcycle Club a level of fame and notoriety greater than anything they'd ever dreamed of. It didn't matter who saw the magazine spread, nobody could deny the inexplicable power that they were witnessing. The club represented a timeless and inspiring ideology of honor, brotherhood, and true freedom that has existed in fraternal organizations from the Vikings to the samurai to the pirates and great warrior tribes the world over. Many saw the club and knew that the world of the 1% was where they belonged. Many people loved them. Some feared them. One thing was for sure: all respected them. Shortly thereafter, a young writer named Hunter Thompson wrote an article and then a whole book on the Angels. The story goes that they allowed him to write the book under the agreement that copies of the book would be given to members of the Oakland Charter and that Thompson would buy the charter a case of beer. It isn't clear whether he ever made good on the agreement. 1965 was a big year for both the Hells Angels and the United States. In March of 1965, President Johnson made the decision to send U.S. combat forces into battle in Vietnam. Unfortunately, many people in the United States were opposed to the conflict, especially young people. The Hells Angels, however, were a club whose membership was comprised of a large number of American war veterans, and because of this, and despite the fact that the American government seemed to target them at every opportunity, as a club they were always very patriotic and supportive of U.S. soldiers abroad. So in October of 1965, when a group of anti-war protesters were causing trouble in the city of Berkeley, California, Sonny and the Angels went to Berkeley and went head-to-head with the protesters, effectively shutting the whole demonstration down. Sonny, being the brilliant and patriotic leader he was, immediately followed up by calling a press conference where he addressed President Johnson and volunteered the Hells Angels for behind-the-line duty in Vietnam, stating that a crack group of trained guerrillas could demoralize the Viet Cong and advance the cause of freedom. It was a brilliant move, though the president never took him up on it. As rumor has it, because he felt that it would have given the Angels too much power. By this time, the Hells Angels were becoming an American icon. It wasn't long after the spread in Life magazine, the Lynch Report, Thompson's book, and now publicly volunteering to fight in the Vietnam War that Hollywood came knocking on the Angels' door. A number of movies were made in the 1960s that were about and or starring members of the Hells Angels. The Wild Angels in 1966, Hell's Angels on Wheels in 1967 and Hell's Angels 69 in 1969 featuring Sonny Barger and Terry the Tramp. The Angels also linked up with countless actors and musicians in the 60s and 70s. The San Francisco clubhouse was across from the Ashbury Grateful Dead house. There was a lot of experimenting with various chemicals and pharmaceuticals back then, and the Angels were often right in the thick of it, having alleged connections to individuals like Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey. It is said that the name Angel Dust was given to PCP because it was the Angels that were pushing it in the early days. The end of the 1960s was marked by what became known as Altamont. Altamont refers to a concert that the Rolling Stones did at Altamont Speedway in California on December 6, 1969. An agreement was made with the Hells Angels to run security for the concert and keep people away from the stage and the equipment after the Angels had successfully run similar gigs for other groups like Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead. Unfortunately, during the Stones concert, the volatile mix of drugs, an anxious crowd and poor decisions led to a young man pulling a firearm in the audience, which then resulted in that young man's death. Naturally, the Angels were blamed for the death, and an angel named Alan Pizarro was arrested. He was later acquitted, but the Angels had spent quite a bit of money on his court costs, and they felt that Mick Jagger needed to pay his share. Initially, he declined to give any help, but when he was enjoying a holiday on his boat off the Atlantic coast, it was alleged that a few Angels set out in their own boat to give him a little convincing. It's not clear exactly what occurred out at sea that day, but what is clear is that Mick Jagger shortly thereafter cut the Angels a check for $50,000 for their troubles, and the matter was closed. The 70s were also a big decade for the Hells Angels. A decade marked by war, court cases, and as always with the Hells Angels, an unparalleled level of mystique and notoriety. It was in the early 70s that the Angels went to war with a small club out of East Los Angeles called the Mongols. A conflict that began over a number of factors, including a woman, an ex-angel, and other unforgotten slights. The first major battle took place at a motorcycle rally known as the Great Western. By all accounts, the Angels won the first battle. Then the second was at another rally known as the Queen Mary that took place on a docked barge in the harbor. By all accounts, the Mongols won the second fight on the Queen Mary. After winning that second battle, the Mongols declared to the Angels that they'd be wearing a California rocker from that point forward. The alleged Angel response was 2 Mongols shot off their bikes that weekend, followed by the detonation of a car bomb at those 2 Mongols' funeral. The car bomb was allegedly preceded by a mysterious stranger walking into the funeral and placing a red and white wreath on the caskets. It is a war that has raged on ever since. It was also during the early 70s that the war between the Angels and the infamous Outlaws M.C. began, when 2 members of the New York City Aliens motorcycle club parted ways. One was Sandy Alexander, who left the Aliens to join the New York Hells Angels. The other was Pete "Greased Lightning" Rogers, who went to Chicago to join the Outlaws. Everything was fine until an alleged sexual assault on an Angels old lady took place at a 1973 New Year's Eve party in New York that resulted in Sandy allegedly beating Greased Lightning half to death over the assault. The beating was quickly followed by the alleged execution-style murders of 2 Lowell, Massachusetts Angels that had gone to Florida and met with Big Jim Nolan of the Outlaws in Florida. This was another war that continued for decades. The early 70s also played host to a highly publicized brawl between Angels from Sandy Alexander's 3rd Street crew and a club called The Breed, where a small number of Angels went up against upwards of 100 Breed members and still gained the upper hand, even going so far as to castrate one of the Breed members. The 1970s also marked the first time that law enforcement would attempt to charge a motorcycle club with conspiracy to violate the RICO Act, when the government charged the Angels in 1979. But the timeless brilliance of the 1%er saved the day for the Angels when prosecutors were left with no leg to stand on, as they had attempted to charge the Angels as one big group with one centralized leadership, when in reality the democratic system of the club was set up as an autonomous charter system. In other words, each charter was its own entity, so the entire organization could never be charged under RICO. Sheer genius, if I do say so myself. Another milestone for the club in the 1970s occurred when a charismatic young man by the name of George Christie began prospecting in Los Angeles in 1975. George earned his patch and quickly climbed the ranks as his early days in the club coincided with the war jumping off with the Mongols. By 1978 there were two Hells Angels charters in Los Angeles, one of which being a group formerly known as Satan's Slaves, which was a Hells Angels brother club that patched over to become Angels, which gave the Angels a huge presence in the San Fernando Valley. Shortly thereafter, George Christie became president of the Los Angeles charter and decided to move the charter to Ventura, where he subsequently remained president for many years. The 70s was also the decade that the Angels made their famous appearance on the Geraldo Rivera television show, where Sandy Alexander and Deacon Proudfoot sat down with Geraldo and went over some of the fallacies and misconceptions about the Hells Angels. The Geraldo interview gave way to the Angels producing their very own movie that was co-produced by Sandy Alexander, the president of the Angels' New York City charter known as the Third Street Crew. This brings me to the 1980s, as the movie was released in 1983. The movie was the first of its kind. It was in uncertain terms, by the Angels and for the Angels. It featured many famous artists of the time, including Willie Nelson, The Grateful Dead, Johnny Paycheck, and several others. To date, the movie Hells Angels Forever continues to be a cult classic among bikers, as it was created through the eyes of and under the supervision of real 1% club members. The 1980s proved to be a difficult era for the club in many ways. It was during the 80s that the club's legendary patriarch Sonny Barger would be diagnosed with throat cancer and undergo a surgery on his throat that resulted in permanent loss of his voice. It was also the decade that a club rat from Alaska named Tony Tate would assist law enforcement in putting Sonny behind bars. All in all, after the raids of 26 locations and the arrests of over 35 Hells Angels, Sonny and 20 of his brothers were indicted, and out of all of them Sonny, Irish O'Farrell and 3 others ended up with relatively short sentences, likely having to do with the questionable tactics used in the undercover investigation. The government admitted to paying Tate over $250,000, and Tate's own ex-wife testified for the defense, stating that Tate was a liar, a scum, and a cheater. Nevertheless, in 1989 Sonny was convicted of conspiracy and sentenced to 57 months in prison in Arizona. During his prison stay one Christmas, he sent the prosecutor a card with a picture of him on a towel as if his prison cell were the beach. The card read, "Nice weather, wish you were here." A message to let the man know that nothing could break Sonny's spirit. He still had his sense of humor and a smile on his face, and his free spirit was something nobody could take away. When he got out of prison, he decided to stay in Arizona, where he set up a patch-over arrangement with the largest club in the state at the time, the Dirty Dozen. The 1980s was also the decade that California hosted the 1984 Olympics, and it was no other than longtime Hells Angels Ventura charter president George Christie that was chosen to carry the Olympic torch through Los Angeles. Shortly thereafter, in 1986, Christie was arrested for allegedly conspiring to have an ex-member of the club taken out. He was acquitted when the prosecution's star witness was determined by the jury to be dishonest and unreliable. After the trial, a member of the jury said that they found George Christie to be very honest, very sincere, and very dedicated not only to his family but also to the Hells Angels. Shortly after his acquittal in the year 1990, George Christie and another legendary angel by the name of Cisco Valderrama did an interview with Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes when the show was doing a special on the Hells Angels and the accusations against them that they were at the top of a narcotics empire. George and Cisco spoke out against the questionable motives and practices of the government and their paid informant, who was also featured on the 60 Minutes special wearing a laughable disguise in an attempt to hide his face. Tony Tate. It would be a fitting welcome to the decade of the 1990s for the club. A decade laden with turmoil for the club. It is alleged by George Christie that one of the main points that he and Sonny never really saw eye to eye on was war with other clubs. George says that he always tried to keep an open mind when it came to dealing with other clubs, and that he would rather have a friend than an enemy wherever possible. He proved this when he went all by himself to meet with the international boss of the Outlaws in 1992. The legendary Taco Bowman. His hope was to quell some of the violence that had been occurring between the two clubs. And that's exactly what happened for a short time, but in these situations it doesn't take much to spark the war back up. George claims that while he was often prone to seek common ground and make peace with other clubs, Sonny was often of the opinion that all other clubs paled in comparison to the mighty Hells Angels, and the only road to peace in any conflict involving the Angels was the unconditional surrender of any and all who opposed them. One could easily understand why he felt that way. Very few organizations on the planet have ever accomplished what the Angels have. Much less other motorcycle clubs. By all accounts, when it came to other clubs, Sonny could be their best friend or their worst enemy. It was during the 1990s that several of the Angels' most notable conflicts took place. The 90s played host to both the Canadian and Nordic biker wars. Both wars beginning in 1994. The Nordic War was fought between chapters of the Angels and the Bandidos in multiple Scandinavian countries. Multiple military and volunteer force armories were burglarized and a large number of high-power weapons stolen, including anti-tank rockets and rocket launchers, rocket-propelled grenades, and an assortment of high-power rifles, explosives, and small arms. It was alleged that those weapons were taken by the two clubs and then used on each other. The Great Nordic Biker War, as it became known, lasted until 1997 before coming to an end by way of a peace treaty and an agreement upon designated territory of each club. The Canadian Biker War, however, turned out to last several years longer than the Nordic War. And was also far bloodier. The conflict in Montreal, Canada was between the Angels and a club called the Rock Machine. The Rock Machine was comprised of ex-members of the SS Motorcycle Club, yet another case of two members of a small lesser-known club parting ways as they take the next step up the ladder. Legendary Hells Angel Mom Boucher and Rock Machine founder and president Salvatore Cazzetta were both at one time members of the SS Motorcycle Club. Mom stepped up to become an Angel and Sal formed the Rock Machine with his brother Giovanni and other ex-SS members. The war was allegedly over narcotics territory. Whatever the cause, it proved to be one of the bloodiest wars between motorcycle clubs to ever take place. At one point during the conflict, several Angels in Canada met a grisly fate, allegedly at the hands of other Angels, when they were caught embezzling from the club. Despite what law enforcement and the media try to portray, when 1%ers are in conflict with one another, they always go to the greatest lengths possible to avoid the collateral damage of innocent civilians. The recurring theme of "it was a miracle no innocent civilians got hurt" is no coincidence. It's by design. However, the war in Canada saw a very low point in 1995 when 11-year-old Daniel Desrochers was killed by shrapnel when a bomb exploded in Montreal. Sadly, the war raged on until ultimately the majority of the Rock Machine was either patched over as Angels or absorbed by the Bandidos. The 1990s also played host to the war between the Illinois Hells Angels and the Chicago Outlaws, when the Angels patched over a club in Illinois called the Hells Henchmen. During this conflict, a bomb exploded in front of the Angels' Illinois clubhouse that turned out to be the third largest explosion on United States soil at the time, after Oklahoma City and World Trade Center. This then led to the Lancaster Speedway shootout in Buffalo, New York between Outlaws and Angels that resulted in multiple deaths. Like I said, the 90s was a rough decade for the Angels. Truth be told, life for the Angels, like other clubs, took a hard left turn after the war in Vietnam and has been a violent existence for much of the club ever since. The Angels entered the 2000s with an enormous bang with the Hellraisers Ball and the Laughlin River Riot shortly thereafter. In February 2002, the Hells Angels were hosting an event called the Hellraisers Ball in New York, and a club called the Pagans decided to show up and crash the party, which led to a shootout and brawl resulting in 73 Pagans being arrested, 1 Pagan dead and a Hells Angel arrested for his murder. Which is strange considering the Angels were the ones being attacked and were on the defensive. His charges were later dropped in a plea deal where he took a lesser weapons charge. The Hellraisers Ball incident was soon overshadowed by what became perhaps the most notorious brawl between 1% clubs to ever take place. The Laughlin riot, as the incident became known, was a fight between the Mongols and Hells Angels on the floor of Harrah's Casino during the Laughlin River Run Biker Rally of 2002 in Laughlin, Nevada. The Angels were staying at the Flamingo Hotel, which was a good ways up the strip from Harrah's Casino where the Mongols were staying. George Christie said in an interview that the entire incident was likely caused by local law enforcement stirring the pot. He claimed that several Angels had reserved rooms at Harrah's, not knowing that the Mongols were also staying there. According to George, there was somewhat of a truce between the two clubs at the time after a number of peace talks had occurred. So the Angels staying at Harrah's were fine. But when local law enforcement saw the small number of Angels in the same casino hotel as hundreds of Mongols, they went to the Flamingo and told the Angels that they better go check on their brothers at Harrah's because they were surrounded by Mongols, so the Angels quickly jumped on their bikes and rolled into Harrah's. Because of the way that the Angels arrived in force ready to defend their brothers that they thought were in trouble, the Mongols also quickly went on the defensive, and within a few moments the tension in the air of that casino was so thick you could cut it with a knife. At that moment an Angel didn't like what he was hearing and he threw a kick at a Mongol's chest, which immediately led to the casino erupting in violence between the two clubs. And every bit of it was caught on the casino's security cameras. The melee lasted a matter of minutes and resulted in the deaths of one Mongol and two Angels. Law enforcement came in and to their surprise all the club members quickly complied with their instructions, and within a short amount of time they had all of the club members subdued on the ground as they began processing the scene. The Mongol that was killed was Anthony Barrera and the two Angels were Jeremy Bell and Robert Tumulty, along with scores of injured and hospitalized on both sides. In the end 7 Angels and 6 Mongols ended up behind bars over the incident. But it had far greater consequences for the motorcycle club world as a whole, as the countless videos that captured the event in its entirety have been used ever since as a tool for law enforcement to go after outlaw club culture. Never before Laughlin had a brawl like that been captured on so many cameras. At the time it was the most violent incident to ever take place on the gambling floor of a Nevada casino. Under the roof of a Nevada casino, for that matter. Violence seems to be a recurring issue, with the Angels from going head-to-head against the protesters in Berkeley in the 60s all the way to the recent beating of a Dirty Ones member at the Indian Larry Festival of 2023. The display of force in Malaysia at the Desaru rally, or the alleged hate crime committed by the Angels in San Diego. Violence seems to follow the Angels right on through history. But the fact is, much of the time they're not the ones to start the fight, but they damn sure are the ones to finish it. I hold firm to my belief that after the Vietnam War many clubs started down a path that would result in them losing their way and forgetting why this culture got started in the first place. George Christie himself was recently quoted in an interview stating that the pivotal moment for me was when I realized that we were becoming the very thing we had once rebelled against. So I'll end this video on the same note that I ended the Outlaws video with. The way of the 1% revolving around true freedom and brotherhood has lived on within this culture. Even in its darkest hour, the true way was always carefully taught and handed down to the right people. If the philosophy of the American 1% biker were America, then Sonny Barger would be Christopher Columbus. He knew this. And it was a responsibility he did not take lightly. He expresses this philosophy in great detail in his book called Freedom Credos from the Road. In the book he says that the greatest constants in his over 50 years in the club were freedom and brotherhood. It is these two constants that guide 1% culture forward, and so long as the way of the 1% lives on, then things will always come full circle and the right people will see the errors in their predecessors' ways and guide the culture into a bright new era by holding firm to the culture's founding principles. Live and let live. Always safeguard and fight for freedom. Never infringe upon it. In the year 2008 a show was created with the Hells Angels playing a number of roles, from technical advisors all the way up to starring roles in the show as actors. Even Sonny had a role in the show, playing the part of Lenny the Pimp. Some people in motorcycle club culture disliked the show because it brought a lot of people into the club world that probably didn't belong. But many people in and out of the club world felt it was the greatest work of cinema ever created. One thing nobody can deny is that for better or worse the show changed the club world forever, and Sonny and the Angels were right at the center of it all, as they have been since day one. Sonny Barger passed away in the year 2022 in his home state of California. The statement he left us with was stay loyal, remain free, and always value honor. We hear you, Sonny. In the words of Johnny Paycheck, ride on Sonny. Lord knows I love you and wish you well. Ride into history with your angels of hell. Rest in peace, Sonny Barger. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for my next video.